Welcome to This Explainer. Right out of the gate, we're diving into the lives of three utterly fascinating ancient voices: Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. These guys were tasked with a literal ground-up rebuild of a broken society. I mean, if you've ever felt torn between just getting through your own daily grind and answering a much bigger, higher calling, well, you're going to find their messages incredibly relatable. They weren't just dusty historical figures. These were real guys trying to pull a beleaguered community together from literal rubble. Just picturing a concrete, painstakingly detailed physical model of the Second Temple area really captures the exact obsession of our three prophets today. For Haggai and Zechariah especially, getting that specific structure off the ground was priority number one. But actually, scratch that, it wasn't just about the bricks and mortar. As we'll see, they were laying down spiritual threads that looked way, way beyond their present moment. Okay, so here's our roadmap. We're going to take a chronological journey, meeting each prophet as a unique character. We'll start with the post-exilic world, then jump into Haggai's shifting priorities, move on to Zechariah's visions of hope, tackle Malachi fighting complacency, and wrap up with how all of this connects to the future. Part 1. The Post-Exilic World, Rebuilding a Shrunken City. All right, to really get their messages, we have to put ourselves right in their shoes. Imagine living in the city of David back then. It wasn't some sprawling, glorious capital anymore. It was tiny, shrunken, just a shadow of its former self. And tracking the timeline of events maps out the struggle perfectly. They had the super joyful start in 539 BC when Cyrus made his decree, right? But then, intense foreign opposition just slammed the brakes on the whole temple project. It sat there, totally stalled out for almost 20 years. It wasn't until around 520 BC when our prophets stepped up and really pushed the community to finally get it done in 516 BC under King Darius I. Which brings us to Part 2, Haggai, Shifting Priorities. So enter Haggai. This guy is an urgent pragmatist, and his message is stunningly modern. He hits them with this completely unfiltered question: is it time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? Basically, your harvests are failing because you're putting your own luxury ahead of your covenant with God. I mean, ouch, right? It's so relatable. We get caught up upgrading our own lives while the bigger kingdom-focused work takes a back seat. Haggai's telling them you're eating, but you're never full, because your priorities are completely upside down. Then Haggai uses this brilliant, simple logic test with the priests. He asks, hey, if holy meat touches a garment, does that make the garment holy? The priests say, no, holiness doesn't transfer like that. Okay, but what if someone who is spiritually defiled by a dead body touches an object? Does the defilement transfer? And the answer is yes, absolutely. It spreads like a contagion. Haggai's point is profound here. Sin is contagious. Just slapping together a new building isn't a magic fix. The people themselves are tainted and need true, deep purification. But he doesn't just leave them hanging in despair. He offers this massive promise from God. My spirit remains among you. Do not fear. You know, the older generation was actually crying because this new, smaller temple looked so unimpressive compared to Solomon's legendary temple. But Haggai casts this wild vision for the future. He promises that God's spirit is going to shake the heavens and fill this seemingly modest little building with an incredible glory that will totally outshine the original. Moving on to Part 3, Zechariah, Visions of Hope. Now, Zechariah is kind of the visionary yin to Haggai's pragmatic yang. They're talking to the exact same exhausted community, but Zechariah is using a totally different, much more mysterious lens. He uses apocalyptic literature. Now, when we hear apocalyptic, we usually think end-of-the-world disaster movies. But here, it simply means looking forward to a time when good finally triumphs over grim, brutal realities, using things like fantastic imagery, intense dreams, and symbolic numbers. It's his way of showing that God is entirely in sovereign control of the big picture. So the crucial takeaway is that his dense, wild visions are actually super organized. There's a clear, logical progression. First, protecting Jerusalem with these patrolling 4 horsemen, then purifying the temple personnel like Joshua and Zerubbabel, and finally, transforming the people by totally removing evil. It's a beautifully structured framework of hope. Take this incredible courtroom vision in chapter 3. You have Joshua the high priest standing there in inexplicably filthy clothes, which represent him bearing the weight of human sin. And Satan, literally the accuser, is right there next to him, ready to pounce. But God completely shuts down the accuser.
He takes away Joshua's filthy clothes and dresses him in these rich, clean garments. It's a dramatic, visual cleansing, and it explicitly sets up Joshua as a symbol for a future messianic figure, referred to as the branch.
And that flows right into a message for the political leader Zerubbabel with this iconic line, "Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit." Zechariah sees a gold lampstand and 2 olive trees, gets confused, and an angel drops this famous quote on him. For a tiny, worn-out community facing massive pushback, hearing that it won't take military might or human strength to finish the job, but solely the Spirit of God, that was a real game changer.
After that, we get these vivid, almost cinematic mini-narratives about dealing with evil, paving the way for a restored people. First, there's a literal flying scroll of curses sweeping through to actively destroy falsehood. Then, and I love this imagery, a wicked woman personifying evil is shoved into a basket, clamped down with a heavy lead cover, and shipped far away back to Babylon. It's a powerful symbol. Evil isn't just managed, it's boxed up and entirely eradicated from the community.
All right, part 4, Malachi, fighting complacency. So let's fast forward a few generations into the era of Nehemiah. The temple is built, the initial thrill of the return has totally worn off, and the community has settled into a really dangerous spiritual rut. Enter Malachi. Fun fact, Malak translates from Hebrew to messenger, and adding the I on the end makes it my messenger. He is God's direct challenger to a society that has grown remarkably lazy and apathetic. The honeymoon phase is well and truly over. And Malachi does not pull his punches with what we can call the complacency challenge. The people are genuinely asking, wait, how have we despised your name? And Malachi is like, are you kidding me? You're bringing blind, lame, and diseased animals for sacrifice. He essentially says, try offering those crummy leftovers to your boss or your governor and see how well that goes over. It's a biting, sarcastic critique of the sheer audacity of giving God anything less than your absolute best.
Finally, part 5, connecting to the future.
The whole shebang builds up to this because none of these 3 prophets were just talking to their peers in the ancient world. They were laying down massive threads for the future. Zechariah's eschatological prophecies, especially, are drawn upon heavily by the New Testament gospel writers to frame the Passion Week of Jesus. We're talking hyper-specific details, a king riding in on a donkey, a betrayal for exactly 30 pieces of silver, the people looking upon the one they have pierced, and the Lord's feet splitting the Mount of Olives in 2. In fact, to put that last one in perspective, the Mount of Olives is still heavily covered in graves today, precisely because people possess this deep desire to be right there when the Lord returns, exactly as Zechariah described. And then Malachi closes out the entire prophetic section of the Hebrew Scriptures with this massive cliffhanger. I will send you, the prophet Elijah, before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He reminds them of the law of Moses and then promises a forerunner is coming to turn the hearts of the people. It is the ultimate bridge that links directly into the opening pages of the Gospels with John the Baptist. So, as we wrap up this explainer, here's a provocative question I really want you to chew on. After periods of great spiritual rebuilding, how do we fight the inevitable creep of complacency in our own lives? Because just like that post-exilic community, we can experience these amazing highs, only to find ourselves a few years later just going through the motions, offering up our leftovers. So how do you keep the spiritual fire burning and prioritize what truly matters? Think on that one. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you in the next explainer.